Hello, this is Richard Payton, and I'm going to discuss the PXT Select assessment, which is a successor to the Profile XT assessment, which you may have used. The PXT Select has two significant updates that are a benefit to both the candidates and to you. First, the PXT Select is an adaptive assessment. So to use numerical ability as an example, the first question asked will come from the middle of the spectrum of questions, and if answered correctly, progressively more difficult questions will be asked, or if not answered correctly, less difficult questions will be asked. Therefore, all candidates will be asked questions that are more appropriate for them, making for a better experience and outcome. So those people, for instance, who are really good at numerical reasoning will be asked the most difficult questions, whereas others won't. This also shortens the average time to complete the assessment by about 15 minutes, making it around 1 hour to complete for most. Second, a few of the attributes measured have been renamed to more accurately reflect what is being measured, and I will discuss these in the report. The assessment provides an objective measure of different attributes of a candidate relative to a performance model, or benchmark if you will, that is based upon top performers for this type of job and a reasonable expectation for success in the job and fit in a team. So before going further, let me explain how the scores in the report are a bell curve distribution of the working population. So if you look at a bell curve or a normal curve, if you will, then 2/3 of the working population score between a 4 and a 7 on the assessment, which means then that on the lower end of any of the scales, you're going to have 13.5% of the working population will score a 2 or a 3, and only the lowest 2.5% score a 1, and the same is true but the opposite on the top end of the spectrum. So only the top 2.5% would score a 10 on any given attribute. So that becomes important when you're looking at scores, and particularly if you're looking where someone has a score that is truly an outlier relative to the performance model. So in the assessment, it's divided up into first a summary graph, which I will scroll down and show. Well, first it actually has an introduction. So telling you that you do have the assessment covers both thinking style, behavioral traits, and as well interests. And the first two of those are the bulk of where the job fit is determined, but the interest section is really important because that can give you an idea about where a person's interests are and therefore how much job satisfaction they're going to have and whether they are more likely to be a long-term fit for that type of position. Okay, so then after we cover the summary graph, then we'll look into more detail because the report also covers what these scores mean and has some behavioral-based interview questions to give you more information on that. And there's even a separate report which can look at a team's results. So going into the detail then about each of these scales. So I'm going to start with the thinking style, but I'm going to actually begin with the verbal skill. And verbal skill is basically a human as a dictionary. And so if you've got someone who scores really high, as this candidate did, then this means that they have a very complete grasp of the English vocabulary, and so they answer this very well. Verbal reasoning is a measure of how well they make use of words. So it's one thing to know the definition, it's another to be able to use it in context. So a person scoring high or low is not necessarily a good or a bad thing unless you look at that relative to the performance model. So the shaded area on each of these scales indicates, and this one is for an operations manager, indicates where a top performer is most likely to score. So on each of these, they're scoring between a 5 and an 8. So a range of 4 stins, if you will, or 4 on the scale. And this individual scoring above can be just as detrimental as a person scoring below, because what this means then is that Relative to others, this person has a higher grasp of both verbal and numerical concepts and may not be able to communicate as effectively as someone who scores closer to the people who are in this or who are working with this role. So the same thing can be true, of course, if this person scored below. It means that they may not be up to communicating as well versus getting frustrated and others getting frustrated at them. So an example might be if you've ever helped someone else with homework, for instance, in a classroom setting, or a child, for instance, with homework. And if they are not picking up on the concepts nearly as quickly as you anticipated, you may be like this person, where you have a much stronger ability than they do. It may be frustrating for you, but equally frustrating for them. Numerical ability is a person as a human calculator. So it's their ability to take numbers and to calculate effectively with those. Numeric reasoning, similar to verbal reasoning, is their ability to use those in context. So this person very clearly high on these measures. The composite score, which actually used to be called learning index, but the composite score is derived from these others, not always a simple average, because the composite score is different, for instance, than simply a measure of IQ. So this measures generally how quickly a person picks up on information and how they can take in that information, not their overall knowledge base, which is really more what IQ is about. So this person has the ability to pick up on concepts very quickly and has very high abilities in these areas. So let me move on then to behavioral traits. Pace is the first, and a person who has a very high pace, they may be one of those people who their knee is bouncing, they do things very quickly, then they score much higher on pace. A person who is much steadier and can be counted on to be able to, at a reasonable pace, take care of the demands of a job, they are going to have a lower score on this. So our candidate has scored near the middle, and the range on this is relatively high. And you'll note in behavioral traits, we don't focus as much on the actual numerical value of the score as we do a relative score. So this person is scoring just below the scale that has been defined, or the range that has been defined for this scale. And being a little bit below or a little bit above is generally not an issue, because when setting the performance model itself, we take that into account. And so the having a score in this area is excellent. Having a score outside of this area doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be not a good fit. Having a score that's significantly outside can be much more detrimental. What that may mean is that a person is needing to stretch more to be able to meet the demands of the job. So similar to when you stretch a rubber band, it creates stress or tension. And when you have tension, then you can have negative effects from that. So being a little bit outside is generally not a big deal. And when setting the score, that's actually, or setting the benchmark or performance model, that's taken into account. That you don't, the question is asked, if you had a score just outside, would that be okay? So assertiveness, a pretty straightforward definition. A person who is assertive, they are more likely to take action when they see something that needs to be done, so they can be more forceful, if you will, versus a person who is less likely or more unassuming, who won't always assert themselves unless they really feel a compelling reason to. At this type of job, it's useful to have a person, this benchmark or performance model is telling us it's useful to have a person who's a bit more assertive, and this candidate is. Sociability is a person's interest and willingness to be more outgoing, so to seek out others and to engage in conversation and being with others versus being more reserved. And so it doesn't mean this person can't be very personable, but it does mean they're less likely to want to be in groups, particularly if they're groups that are not well known to them, so they may be more reserved. Our candidate, again, is in the middle of this performance model, so this appears to be a good fit. Conformity. This is one, oh, by the way, I should mention, the pace used to be called energy level, and that has some bearing to this, not as precise as the word pace. So a person with a high energy level tends to have a higher pace. A person with a lower energy level tends to have a lower pace. Conformity used to have a different measure, different title called manageability, which is somewhat similar. Conformity tells you whether this person is similar to our candidate here, more strong-willed, more needs to be able to figure out themselves what needs to be done and how to go about doing whatever needs to be done, versus a person who's more compliant, who in large organizations often you'll find that you have a lot of people who are more on the compliant spectrum because you are working with other people, and so being able to know what's expected and what needs to be done versus figuring it out yourself is much more common. So if we're looking for areas that could be red flags on this candidate, any area where they're more than a single scale outside of the performance model, and that's the case here. So this will be an area that we'll look at some of the behavioral-based interview questions to find out what is it really that we're going to be looking for regarding this person and their measure on conformity. Outlook used to be called attitude. I think outlook is really a better descriptor for this. So this is whether a person has more of a trusting outlook or more of a skeptical outlook. So it may not be too surprising that a candidate like this, there are interactions between the different scales. And so a person that is very high in thinking style may think about things more, and that's not necessarily always true, but you may find that a person who's higher on this scale may actually be more skeptical in their outlook. They think about things a bit more. And a person who's very trusting can be a really pleasant person to be around because they're not second-guessing, they're not being skeptical of what you're saying, but it's really good in many positions, and this one is likely true of the operations manager position, that you don't want them necessarily taking everything that's told to them at face value. Decisiveness. Pretty straightforward measure, and a person who is willing to take a bit more risk is more decisive, so they're a bit more bold, if you will. When they're more deliberate, then they take more information into account. They don't make as quick of decisions. This candidate is in the middle of the performance model, so that's a good fit. Accommodation. You've got those who are extremely agreeable and those who they don't accommodate as much, so they're more steadfast in their views. And this candidate, again, is in the performance model for this, and so once more, a good fit. The independence measure is often an inverse of what you see with conformity, and that's exactly the case here. It's not always the case. You could have a person who is very independent, who is also very compliant and works well with others, definitely. But in this case, we have someone who is more strong-willed and not real surprisingly, very independent. So that can be detrimental, of course, if you've got a position where it's ideal for someone to take into account the input of others and to work significantly with others versus being very autonomous, or it could be equally detrimental if you have a person who is very low on independence, therefore very reliant on others. This can be wonderful if you've got a person who's very reliant, if you've got a job where they get a lot of direct supervision, but if you have a manager or supervisor who does not want to constantly be touching base and making sure everything is going well with this candidate and not being asked questions by this candidate about whether this is right or that is right, then this highly reliant individual may not be a good fit for a position. So either extreme can be difficult. You have some jobs where it's very important for a person to be highly independent or not highly independent, and so the performance models will be different for different jobs for that reason. Judgment used to be called objective judgment, so it's very close. This is a measure of how much a person is kind of like Spock, if you will, from Star Trek, or Sergeant Friday from the movie Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am. And then you've got your more highly intuitive individuals who score lower. These individuals, not only can they be more highly intuitive, they can also be highly emotional. This person may be less emotional. This candidate, again, just outside of the performance model for this, you would anticipate for an operations manager that they probably are somewhat trending to the more factual side of the judgment spectrum, and that's the case here. So altogether, not a poor fit there. Interests. So there are 6 interests. Enterprising, basically sales type approach, looking at optimizing the organization and its financial results. Financial admin has really more to do with organization and coordination of information and procedures, things of that nature. Technical really relates to dealing with technical type of details, handling processes as well. Creative is pretty straightforward as far as that being a measure of just how a person is, drawn to arts, for instance, or other creative endeavors. Mechanical is more working with their hands. People service, clearly working more with people. So with this type of position, the top 3, or the performance model, the top 3 interests are enterprising, financial, admin, people, and enterprising, financial, admin are top interests of this candidate. People service is actually in the lower quadrant, but they're looking for at least having a couple of the interests match. So overall job fit doesn't look to be tremendous, primarily because all of these scales plus the couple of others are significantly outside. But when you're looking at how many red flags are there truly, then if you can talk through some of these measures and see if this individual may be a good fit yet, then that can let you know whether this candidate is actually overall possibly a good fit. So all in all, these are pretty strong indicators. It's always nice to have a person who is high on thinking style as long as they're not too high on thinking style. And that can overcome a lot of other areas where maybe they may not be as good of a fit, but because of their cognitive ability, they can maybe overcome some of that. So the next section starts getting into more of the details. So this tells you for thinking style, for instance, the composite score, where your ideal candidate scores, and where this candidate scores. So this tells you kind of the bottom line on this. More easily picks up new skills and information than is typical for this position. Could experience boredom, good point that I didn't bring out earlier, and may not necessarily be as patient with others, and others may get frustrated with them. So then if we go down, I'm going to skip past these we talked about conformity. So this describes the ideal candidate and says that this candidate is less willing to follow standard procedures, particularly I would say if they feel like the standard procedure is not a good standard procedure. And so if you push past this, then after you get past the interest, then you have the challenge areas. And so first and foremost, we do have conformity. And here in the report is where it'll tell you again kind of what the bottom line is for this and what you might want to listen for. And then it actually has a couple of questions that you can ask. So we have that in a similar way when you get down to the verbal skill, verbal reasoning, these other areas where the scores of this candidate were outside of the performance model. And they're numbered so that if you want to drill straight down to question number 5 because you think this may be very important, then you can do that, or if you want to point it out to someone else. So that's the layout of the report for this. And in addition to this report, if you have a number of individuals who have completed this assessment, and anyone who has completed the Profile XT can retake this assessment, and there's no additional cost for that. So you can then generate, for people who have taken this PXT Select assessment, you can actually look at where the individual falls relative to the people on their team. So this is a team of 6, and this shows for this candidate, it's actually a different candidate in this case, different example, but it shows where this candidate falls relative to the others. So in some cases, there's a pretty broad distribution of scores, although you may have some other outliers. And so we have outliers on these. This candidate is not an outlier on those, but when we get down to, I thought there was at least one that was an outlier. Oh, this one is an outlier, but not too extreme of an outlier. But there are some other people who are outliers relative to the group. And so this can give you an indication of where an individual may have some friction with an individual or the group, because the more distant one person's scores are from others, the more likely that they may not work as comfortably with those others. And so this report actually just focuses on the behavioral-based attributes, doesn't get into the interests or the cognitive. Cognitive can have similar sort of effects, as I've already described, but this report focuses on the behavioral base. So with that, then I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, but I thank you for your time and wish you all the very best, and certainly let me know if I can help in any other way. Thanks so much. Goodbye.